basketball, we're always haunted by the same question: what if? What if Derrick Rose had never gotten injured? If Drazen Petrovic hadn't died in that crash? If a European player had made it to the NBA 10 years earlier? But among all those ghosts, there's one that rises higher than the rest. A guy who scored more points than Kareem, than LeBron, and than any other legend who ever stepped on a court. A guy who never needed an NBA contract to become eternal, and the most incredible part, he did it while the world ignored him as if he didn't exist. His name was Oscar Schmidt. In Brazil, they called him La Mano Santa, the Holy Hand. In Italy, they worshipped him like a rock star. And in the United States, they remember him with a mix of respect and shame because one night in 1987, he dropped almost 50 points on them and taught them the lesson of their lives. Oscar never played in the NBA, and yet he ended up being the top scorer in basketball history. A paradox that opens up the most uncomfortable question: what would have happened if Schmidt had played in the biggest league in the world? Would he have changed history, or was his legend only possible precisely because he never entered? Brazil, the 1960s, a country where everything revolved around a ball, but a soccer ball. The culture was so all-consuming that any kid who wanted to be anything other than Pelé, Garrincha, or Tostão seemed like an alien. In that environment, Oscar Daniel Bezerra Schmidt was born in Natal, Rio Grande do Norte on February 16, 1958. He was taller than everyone else from a young age, but no one thought about basketball. The logic was that if you were tall, you were useful as a goalkeeper in the neighborhood games. Oscar didn't fit in. He wasn't quick on his feet, nor did he have the juggler's talent that Brazilian soccer demanded. What he did have was a height that made him awkward on the grass field and pushed him, almost by default, toward a sport that was, at the time, doomed to be the other one. Basketball in Brazil was almost a curiosity, with small tournaments, little audience, and none of the grandeur. It was like choosing to play the recorder when everyone else wanted to be a rock guitarist. His first coach was like a character out of a storybook, the Japanese Lorindo Moura, a guy who saw basketball as a craft. His training methods were bizarre. He made the kids dribble while picking up rocks or run zigzag through ropes and chairs as if they were circus obstacles. What might have seemed ridiculous to anyone else was foundational for Oscar. He learned ball control, coordination, and above all, patience. And that's when the unexpected happened. Oscar discovered he had a gift in his right hand. The ball came off cleanly with a perfect arc and dropped into the hoop again and again. While his classmates went off to play soccer, he stayed alone on the court shooting, adjusting his mechanics, obsessed with a detail that almost no one in Brazil took seriously. Basketball became a refuge, an identity. From a very young age, he began to stand out. Not because he jumped like an athlete or was fast as lightning, but because he had what's hardest to find in basketball: a reliable shot. That's where the Holy Hand was born. In that country, where being a basketball player was little more than a weird hobby, Oscar chose to go against the grain. What seemed like a teenager's whim would end up being the first step in a career so unusual it was impossible to measure by anyone else's standards. At 16 years old, Oscar was already fully immersed in basketball. He wasn't a teenager playing as a hobby. He was someone starting to see himself as a professional. His entry into the Palmeiras club marked a turning point. There, surrounded by older players and more serious coaches, he found the perfect setting to test whether his talent was just a neighborhood fluke or if he could truly build a career. The answer came quickly. In just 85 games with Palmeiras' youth team, Oscar scored 2,114 points, an average of nearly 25 per game. An insane number for someone his age in a basketball scene that was still far from being as structured as it is today. These numbers weren't padded in minor leagues, they were a warning of what was to come. In 1974, he was crowned champion of the São Paulo State Tournament, and in 1977, he won the national title with Palmeiras. Brazil still didn't see him as a media phenomenon, but in the hallways of the local basketball world, everyone was talking about that tall, skinny guy who scored from everywhere. And it didn't stop there. He moved to Mackenzie College and exploded even more. In 36 games, he scored 1,332 points, an average of 37 per game. Numbers that today, in retrospect, seem unreal. Schmidt was no longer just a promising kid, he was an offensive machine. What stood out the most was his style. He was 2.05 meters tall, 6 feet 9 inches, but didn't play like the classic big men of the era who lived under the basket. Oscar moved outside, shot from mid and long range. Even when the three-point line hadn't yet been introduced in Brazil, without knowing it, he was inventing the concept of the stretch big, a big man who spaces the floor. At just 20 years old, he had already become an anomaly. His teammates looked for him all the time because they knew that if the ball got to him, it would almost certainly end in points. His obsession with shooting had become a lethal weapon. In a country where basketball was a marginal sport, Oscar Schmidt was beginning to write a rare narrative, that of a teenager who didn't play like a teenager but like someone destined to break every record. And the biggest leap was still to come. Europe. In 1982, at just 24 years old and with an already massive reputation in Brazil, Oscar decided to make the leap to Europe. Basketball in his country had become too small for him, and the opportunity to play in Italy was too tempting. That's how he landed at Juve Caserta, a second division team aiming for promotion and a place among the elite. For Oscar, it was the perfect move, a club that trusted him as its cornerstone and a league that was gaining prestige thanks to the arrival of foreign stars. Italy embraced him quickly. In a country where basketball had much more cultural weight, Oscar found fans, media, and opponents that pushed him to raise his level. And what happened was explosive. In 7 years with Caserta, he led the Italian league in scoring 6 times. The fans began calling him La Mano Santa, the Holy Hand, a nickname that spread like a trademark. He didn't just score points, he scored all the points. There were games where he put up 60 or more, and in 1991, already playing for Pavia, he scored 66 in a single game. These were absurd numbers for any professional league. One of his most iconic moments came in the 1989 European Cup Winners' Cup final against Real Madrid. That night, Oscar scored 44 points, shot from everywhere, hit impossible threes, and carried Caserta on his back. They lost 117-113, but the performance stuck in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. It was like watching a lone sniper fight an entire army. What stood out the most was how Oscar broke the unwritten rules of the era. He was 2.05 meters tall, a size associated with low post play and dirty work in the paint, but he played outside, shot threes like a shooting guard, and had such a quick release that defenders couldn't react. In an era where big men were anchors near the rim, Oscar looked like he was playing modern basketball 3 decades ahead of his time. In Italy, he also met a boy who watched him from the stands with admiration, a kid named Kobe Bryant. He lived there because his father played in the Italian league, and years later he would recall that Oscar was his first idol, even nicknaming him La Bomba. That is, before he became obsessed with Michael Jordan, Kobe dreamed of being Oscar Schmidt. Italy was more than just a phase, it was the laboratory that shaped Oscar into a myth. There he tested himself against tougher defenses, against top European opponents, and above all, found the platform to prove that he could be the top scorer anywhere on the planet. Meanwhile, in the United States, they still saw him as a stranger, and that cultural clash was about to explode. Oscar Schmidt was already a well-known name in Brazil and Europe. In Italy, he was unstoppable, scoring at will, filling arenas, and even being idolized by fans as if he were a Serie A striker. But on the other side of the Atlantic, in the NBA, his name still carried little weight, and when he finally got the chance to be selected in the draft, what seemed like a dream turned out to be almost a slap in the face. In that very draft, the same one in which Michael Jordan was selected by the Chicago Bulls, Schmidt's name appeared buried, hidden deep in the list, 6th round, pick number 131, chosen by the New Jersey Nets. For anyone else, it might have been exciting. For Oscar, it was a blow to his pride. He couldn't understand how someone who had been a professional for years, who was leading scorers in Europe, could be treated like a throwaway player. At that time, international basketball still meant nothing to the NBA. In the eyes of American executives, anything happening outside their college system had no real value. And that perception left a mark. Schmidt explained it years later with brutal honesty. "It offended me. I wasn't a nobody. Falling that low was a sign of disrespect." The truth was, by the numbers, he had nothing left to prove. His seasons in Brazil and Italy showed him to be a phenomenal scorer, but the most powerful league on the planet had shoved him into a corner, almost as if saying, if you want to come, start from the very bottom, and Oscar wasn't the kind of person to stay quiet in the face of a snub. That draft selection was the first major cultural clash between Schmidt and the NBA, a player who had been a full-blown superstar in Europe, treated like an unknown in the United States. His response wasn't yet clear, but in that moment, the seed was planted for a decision that would forever define his career. After the draft and the bitter taste of falling so low, Oscar still agreed to travel to the United States. He didn't go to seek personal revenge. He went to prove he belonged. In practices and preseason games with the Nets, he made it clear who he was. He averaged 25 points in just 25 minutes of play. They weren't official games, but the message was loud and clear. That Brazilian nobody seemed to know could score on anyone. The Nets were quickly convinced. They offered him something very rare at the time, a guaranteed contract with no cut clause. It was a chance to stay in the NBA with security, to rub shoulders with the biggest names, and maybe write a different story. But there was a hidden trap. Back then, FIBA had a strict rule. Any player who signed with the NBA was automatically banned from their national team. For Oscar, that meant giving up Brazil, the Olympic Games, and the green and yellow jersey he had proudly worn since he was a teenager. And not just that, financially, it didn't make sense either. In Italy, he was already earning more than what the Nets were offering him. It was a brutal dilemma. On one side, the spotlight of the NBA, the dream of every player. On the other, the honor of continuing to represent his country and a financial stability he wasn't willing to give up. Oscar explained it with striking clarity. If I played a single game in the NBA, I could never wear the Brazil jersey again. For me, that jersey was more important than any league. And so, when most would have said yes without hesitation, Schmidt said no. He turned his back on the biggest show in the world to stay loyal to the Brazilian flag and his place in Europe. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the one that defined his life. The moment Oscar chose identity over fame. In 1987, Indianapolis hosted the Pan American Games. For the United States, the tournament was little more than a formality. Their team was made up of future NBA stars: David Robinson, Danny Manning, Rex Chapman, all college players, but with the kind of talent that seemed destined to dominate any competition. Brazil arrived as the uncomfortable guest, a solid team with a few strong names, but far from being favorites. No one imagined that the final on July 23rd would go down in legend. The game started as everyone expected. The United States on top, physically dominant, setting the pace. At halftime, the scoreboard showed 68-54 for the hosts. Everything pointed to yet another blowout in the never-ending list of American home victories. But in the third quarter, Oscar Schmidt showed up. It was as if he had suddenly decided that this night wouldn't be just another game. He started launching from everywhere. Threes from 4 meters behind the arc, impossible shots with a defender in his face, contested layups against kids who outmatched him physically. And they went in, one after another, after another. Brazil, which had looked dead, started to believe. Schmidt dropped 35 points in the second half alone. By the end of the game, he had 46 points, including 7 three-pointers, and Brazil overturned what had seemed unbreakable, 120-115 over the United States. It was the first time in history that the U.S. lost an official game on home soil with a college roster, and the wound was deep. Until that day, it was believed that American basketball was untouchable at home. Schmidt and Brazil proved otherwise. Oscar, on the verge of tears, summed it up with a phrase that still echoes, "It's the greatest victory of our lives. We know they're the best, but tonight we were better." That game was more than a win. It was living proof that Oscar had been right to choose Brazil's jersey over signing with the NBA. That night, in front of the eyes of the world, he turned the eternal what if into a clear and resounding "look what I just did." If the 1987 Pan American Games had put Oscar Schmidt on the world map, what he did a year later at the Seoul Olympic Games defied all logic. It was the confirmation that this wasn't just a hot streak or a one-off epic performance. What he was doing was a cosmic anomaly. Brazil wasn't a contender for anything. They arrived with a hard-working team, but without the firepower of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, or the United States. Still, Oscar carried the entire tournament on his shoulders. In 8 games, he averaged 42.3 points and 7.8 rebounds per game. Yes, 42 points per game in a competition featuring the best national teams on the planet. In each of the last 4 games, he scored more than 41 points. It didn't matter what defense they threw at him or what tactical traps were set, he always found a way to score. And if in Indianapolis he had proven he could take on the Americans, in Seoul he showed he could take on anyone. Brazil didn't win a medal. They were eliminated with no collective glory. But Schmidt emerged as a symbol. He became the all-time leading scorer in Olympic basketball history with 1,093 points across 5 editions. No other player has ever reached that mark. His style was ahead of its time. While most big men barely took mid-range shots, Oscar was launching threes like a shooting guard. He averaged more than 8 three-point attempts per game with nearly 45% accuracy. In a basketball world where the three-point revolution hadn't yet arrived, Schmidt was already playing like he had been born in the age of Steph Curry. That tournament also marked a turning point for the United States. Seeing a foreign player dominate like that forced a reevaluation of the system. 4 years later, the response would be the 1992 Dream Team in Barcelona. In large part, the decision to bring NBA players into the Olympics was born because players like Oscar had proven that American dominance was no longer guaranteed. What he did was historic. Wildly historic. In Seoul, Oscar Schmidt didn't just score points, he forced the basketball world to admit that talent existed outside the NBA, and that it could be just as dangerous, if not more. Barcelona, 1992. Basketball was about to change forever. For the first time, FIBA allowed NBA players to participate in the Olympic Games. The result was immediate. The United States assembled the most powerful team ever seen, the Dream Team. Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, a collection of legends sharing the same locker room. And there was Brazil, with Oscar Schmidt already 34 years old. He wasn't the same player physically, but he was still a deadly sharpshooter. The matchup against the US ended in a blowout, 127-83 in favor of the Dream Team. But even in that storm, Oscar carved out his place in history. He scored 24 points, the highest number any single player put up against the Dream Team throughout the tournament. Not the Croatians, not the Lithuanians, not the Spaniards. No one punished that legendary defense like Schmidt did. Wearing the yellow jersey, he kept launching impossible threes, unafraid of the moment, unafraid of the stars in front of him. For the US, it was just another win. For Oscar, it was confirmation that he could score against anyone, even against the greatest basketball team ever assembled. Larry Bird, who had already praised him as one of the best scorers of our era, experienced firsthand the Brazilian who played like he had arrived from the future. Ironically, by 1992, the rule that once banned NBA players from national teams was no longer in place. If Oscar had waited, he could have signed with the NBA and still worn Brazil's jersey. But by then, at 34, his prime was behind him. The train had already left the station. The clash with the Dream Team is remembered as a minor footnote in US basketball history. But for Brazil and for Schmidt, it was a symbol. Even when the talent gap was overwhelming, La Mano Santa remained a scorer who forced everyone to take notice. When many thought Oscar Schmidt's career was winding down, he decided to open an unexpected chapter. In 1993, at 35 years old, he joined Spain's Liga ACB, one of the toughest and most competitive leagues in Europe. For most players, that age marked the beginning of retirement. For Oscar, it was just another excuse to prove that scoring without limits was simply what he did. In his first season with Valladolid, he averaged more than 33 points per game. Yes, at 36 years old, he was putting up the same numbers he had in his youth. In a brand of basketball where the three-point line was already being exploited more, Schmidt became a permanent spectacle. 40 to 45, even 47-point games with extremely high shooting percentages from long range. In one of those games, he went 8 from 8 from three-point range, something unthinkable for a player of his size and in that era. He was a 2.05-meter big man playing like a modern shooting guard, spacing the floor, finding his spot, and releasing the ball with a speed that baffled defenders. His style looked like something out of the 2020 NBA, but he was doing it in 1994. In just 2 seasons in Spain, he racked up over 2,000 points in 71 games. His opponents knew exactly what he was going to do, but they couldn't stop it. He'd step behind the line, raise the ball above his head, and in. Predictable, and at the same time, unstoppable. Spain confirmed what Italy had already shown. Oscar was ahead of his time. In an era still dominated by big men who lived in the paint, he proved that a tall player could redefine the game from the perimeter. In a way, he was the missing link between Larry Bird and the generation that decades later would put the three-pointer at the heart of the sport. By the time his Spanish stint ended and he returned to Brazil, he was more myth than player. But even as the years went by, no one could deny what they had seen in the ACB, a veteran who played like he was still 20 and who proved that his obsession with scoring knew no age or borders. The most incredible part of Oscar Schmidt's story is that his influence wasn't limited to Brazil or Europe. His name reached the ears of the greatest in the NBA, and not as a distant rumor, but as a reference they themselves admired. Larry Bird, arguably the best shooter of his generation and a Boston Celtics legend, put it bluntly. He's one of the best scorers of our era. Larry Legend, who rarely handed out compliments, saw in Oscar a mirror, someone who embodied the value of a scorer who dared to do what no one else would. But the deepest impact he made was on a kid who would go on to become one of the icons of modern basketball, Kobe Bryant. During his childhood in Italy, Kobe would go to the games to watch Oscar with the same devotion other kids had for superheroes. He called him La Bomba. And when his father, Joe Bryant, tried to talk to him about Jordan or Magic, Kobe would always respond with the same obsession. His idol was Oscar Schmidt. That detail says it all. The player who never set foot in the NBA became the inspiration for one of the greatest who ever would. It's as if basketball history itself refused to leave him out of the grand narrative. Oscar didn't need NBA validation. His shot, his obsession, and his legacy had already crossed borders and generations, being called La Mano Santa in Brazil, La Bomba by Kobe, and one of the best scorers of all time by Larry Bird aren't official titles, but together they paint the true portrait of Schmidt, a man who, from outside the NBA, still found his way into the memory and respect of the very idols who ruled the league. The legend of Oscar Schmidt stands atop a mountain of points, but behind that obscene number, nearly 50,000 career points, there was also a side of his game that always raised doubts. Defensively, Oscar was a very human player. He wasn't quick on his feet, he lacked the tactical discipline to track the most athletic opponents, and often looked outright disinterested in that part of the game. You could see his frustration during defensive breakdowns, or he would simply step aside when the opposing attack got past him. In an NBA filled with explosive shooting guards and small forwards, that weakness might have have been a wound too hard to hide. His other major criticism was his court vision. Oscar wasn't a passer. He had moments of awareness, sure, but the truth is he rarely gave up the ball if he saw even the slightest chance to shoot. And for him, shooting meant almost every time. In his European teams and with Brazil's national team, that approach was accepted. Let him shoot because he'll score more than anyone else. But in a league like the NBA, where defenses were tougher and double teams constant, you needed the ability to punish opponents with the extra pass. Oscar almost never did that. This raises the big question, would his jaw-dropping numbers have survived the reality of the NBA? Maybe yes, thanks to a shooting talent decades ahead of its time. Maybe no, because in a league obsessed with physical intensity, he might have been forced to give more than he was willing to in the less glamorous aspects of the game. The myth of Oscar also grew because we never saw him in that context. He never had to face elite defenders night after night in an 82-game league. He never had to deal with coaches who would have benched him for every missed rotation. He was never forced to share the ball with other offensive stars on an NBA team. And that's the paradox. His legend is built as much on what he did as on what we'll never know if he could have done. He was a genius scorer, but also a pure specialist with limitations that might have chipped away at the myth had he played in the United States. Oscar Schmidt ended his career with 49,737 points, more than any player in the history of organized basketball. A number that sounds made up, yet is recorded in every stat sheet from his nearly 3 decades on the court. He played in 5 Olympic Games, led the scoring charts everywhere he went, and was inducted into both the FIBA Hall of Fame and the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. All of it, without ever playing in the NBA. That contrast makes him a rare, almost uncomfortable myth. Americans still debate whether he could have survived the grind of their league. Brazilians remember him as a hero who chose his country's jersey over any contract. Europeans revere him as one of the great showmen of his era. Oscar never needed the NBA to be remembered, but his absence also made him the sport's greatest what if. Would history have changed if he had accepted that offer from the Nets? Or does his myth exist precisely because we never got to see him there? We'll never have the answer. And maybe that's where the magic lies. Oscar Schmidt was so great, not even the most powerful league in the world could contain him in its story. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. This was Hoop Secrets, and I'll see you next time.